Should Catholic priests be allowed to get married? I know it's early on a Sunday morning, so get comfy. This is a theologically heavy homily. Soon after my priestly ordination in 2011, I was invited to speak at Sydney University. And the title of the topic was Celibacy, Yuck, exclamation mark. And such a title would have once summarized very accurately my own sentiments on the notion of celibacy. For certainly the most challenging part of my discernment in thinking about becoming a priest as a teenager was coming to terms with the commitment to a lifelong celibacy, a lifelong commitment to never being married or having children of my own. So I'm by no means immune to the provocative nature of priestly celibacy. Nor am I surprised that in an increasingly promiscuous and pleasure-driven society, celibacy is met with secular abhorrence and natural bewilderment. Why on earth would you do that? Indeed, it is vigorously countercultural and in a certain sense, absolutely counterintuitive. And everyone, including the mass media, is quick to express their opinions on this provocative topic. An opinion that more often than not reflects no attempt whatsoever to understand the rich history, tradition, and theology that undergirds this noble discipline. Instead, you hear things like this. There were once married priests in the early church, so why not have them now? Or is this really just about the church trying to save money because they don't have to pay you a proper wage? Or why not? Why not allow priests to get married? The church just needs to get with the times. All those pieces of rhetoric are understandable, but in truth they are very superficial. It's so important that we at least try to know why. Today's gospel, however, provides just one of the key theological reasons as to why Christ himself was celibate and why priests are called to imitate his example. Namely, that celibacy is a palpable sign in the world that points to the promise of the life of the world to come. It's meant to point to the possibility, the reality of resurrection. So what does that actually mean, and why does it matter? Well, to understand the gospel, you've got to understand the context. Jesus is being confronted by a group of Sadducees, and Sadducees were a very wealthy, aristocratic-like, elite Judaic sect. And the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in the immortality of the soul. And what they're trying to do is trap Jesus. They say, well, look, if there is a resurrection, if people do rise again, then what about this woman? She's married 7 times to 7 brothers. Whose wife will she be then at the resurrection? So they're just trying to catch him out. And Jesus gives a very beautiful and succinct reply. He says, the children of this world take wives and husbands, but those who are judged worthy of a place in the other world and in the resurrection from the dead, they do not marry because they can no longer die. Now, in that one sentence, Jesus has given us the basic theology not only behind priestly celibacy, but also behind marriage. The dead do not marry because they can no longer die. Which only goes to stress that at the end of the day, the ultimate purpose of marriage is to bring your spouse to heaven. And yet, how many couples today would think that's the ultimate purpose of marriage? How many Christian couples get married today with that obligation at the forefront of their minds? And if not, well, have they really truly understood the Christian nature of marriage itself. What does that mean for a priest then? Does that mean a priest is already dead if he does not marry? Well, in a certain sense, yes. Priests theoretically are meant to be dead to the world, hence the black clothing. But more pertinently, it's meant to be a positive sign in the world that we will live a life in heaven, redeemed and resurrected. And that's exactly what Christ himself was witnessing to. As a Jew, it would have been hugely countercultural not to be married. But his celibacy, his marriage to heaven, even here on earth, was to become a powerful sign that heaven is possible, that salvation is possible, that the dead will rise again. But no longer will they rise married to each other, they will rise married to God himself. Because the priest is called to imitate Christ in every way, he freely, you are never forced to become a priest. In fact, if you are forced into the priesthood, that's one great and grave reason you can be laicized, removed. You freely choose to follow our Lord's invitation. Come, leave everything, and follow me. Now, to leave everything in order to serve him obviously highlights the practical or pragmatic nature of celibacy, which you would all be familiar with. In other words, as St. Pope John Paul II said, I make myself alone so that no one has to be alone. In other words, and it resonates very powerfully with my priestly experience, when someone is dying alone in the hospital at 3 a.m., you don't have a family to worry about. You can get out of bed and go and be with that lonely person. It gives you freedom then to hold the hands of a stranger or to be available to them when they need you, to move to Oxford when your bishop asks you, or to lecture full-time in philosophy and run a parish. I would be a dreadful husband and father with the current schedule anyhow. Now the danger is celibacy could lead to self-centeredness. You just become a selfish bachelor. Because as you know, in married life, you immediately have to mature because you are living for the sake of the other. And so if a priest is not busy, it's a bad sign. He should be busy. You will be unhappy if you're not giving yourself in some way, as you do, many of you here today do in married life. Because both vocations are a call to sacrifice, to self-sacrifice. And fidelity and faithfulness in that sacrifice inspires others to be faithful and self-sacrificial. Now, I acknowledge this is a huge topic, and I'm only just scraping the surface, and I can hardly do justice to it in less than 10 minutes. But if I might make one final catechetical point that's often raised. When people say, well, what about priests in the early church? The apostles, weren't they married? Yes, they were married. But if you read the early church, I could cite to you all the various documents and literature on this, you would quickly discover that it was a requirement that after a man got married, had his children, if he then felt called to the priesthood, his wife had to agree, and that they would live as brother and sister. In other words, continence, sexual continence, was an expectation after ordination. Not that marriage is anyway a bad thing, but it was the sign that after your ordination, the priest was to act in the person of Christ, particularly at Mass. And so he was meant to live like Christ in every way. And when the Gregorian reforms that made celibacy compulsory in the 11th century, it was largely in response to scandal. The priests were getting divorced or having affairs and so forth. So look, obviously you don't have to agree with me on whether or not priests should remain celibate, but at least today I think the gospel points to two very important things. Firstly, before you make a judgment on a hot-button teaching, allow yourself to read and study the reasons why. Don't just follow the media. Don't just allow contemporary standards to be applied to the gospel. Read and study and then make up your own mind. And then secondly, let's take up with renewed vigor this call to faithfulness, whether it be as priest or as husband or as wife or as layperson. For in a world that is obsessed with selfish pleasure, a faithful wife, a faithful husband, a faithful priest should all point to that same greater reality, that death leads to resurrection. And more than ever in today's world, the world needs to be reminded of that fact.